The 30th Sunday of the Ordinary Time. We've got 4 weeks left. 4 weeks left in this church year. And the 4th week is the Feast of Christ the King, the big celebration for the end of the year. And then the next week, we begin the first Sunday of Advent. We introduce the new Missal, the new translation. And we get down into the season of Advent, and then it's Christmas. By now, you should have everything wrapped and put away, you're all set. But the church is looking at this end of the year. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to hear readings that are a little tough. Like today is it sounds easy, but it's really not. The readings are going to begin to talk about the end of time, the end of the world, judgment. The 4 last things, heaven, hell, death, and judgment. It's going to talk about those things. It's going to challenge us to say, okay, we've been through all of these things. We've been through the life of Jesus. We've talked about discipleship. Now, we come down to what it's really all about. Because you see, the day that each of us was born, we all began to die. It is something that each and every one of us, while we don't like to talk about it, it's a reality for us all. And death is not the failure of medicine. Death is not a mistake that somebody made. It is the natural end of all of our lives, whether it comes when we're 14, 40, or 104. It is the natural end of all of our lives. It is what we were born to do. And so the Gospels begin to ask us, have we heard the message of Jesus? Have we put it into practice? As Deacon Bill pointed out several weeks ago, that these weeks of ordinary time challenge us to say, okay, well, this is the message of Jesus. This is what it looks like in daily life. Did you get it? And now, how do we live it on a daily basis? Today's gospel is really kind of fascinating. Let's take a look at the second reading first, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. Deacon Bill pointed out, this is the very first book written in the New Testament, only about 18 to 20 years after Jesus has died and returned to the Father. And already, the early Christians in Thessalonica are saying, okay, so when's he coming back? We're ready. Is he coming back yet? Because they really believed that Jesus would return quickly. 2,000 years later, we're still waiting. But they really believed that it would happen now. And so they had this kind of end-time sense of how do we live now? How do we make it work? And in the gospel, Jesus reaches back to his Jewish roots, reaches all the way back to the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, and summarizes the law. This same statement appears in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses says it's all about compassion. And Jesus repeats that and says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That sounds so beautiful. And we put it on posters and in artwork and in windows and everything else. But it's so hard to do when it comes down to day-to-day living. It's so hard to do. I mean, take a look at our first reading from the book of Exodus. Very simple thing. Moses tells the people, if your neighbor needs to borrow from you, give it to him. And don't expect any interest on the loan. If you borrow your neighbor's cloak, and remember, they wore their bed all the time. The cloak that they wore, that was what they slept in. If you borrow your neighbor's cloak, give it back to him. Otherwise, what's he going to sleep in tonight? And don't charge an interest on a loan. That's why historically, all the great banking houses of Europe are Jews. because Christians were forbidden to charge interest on a loan. It was a sin. So who else is left? In those days, there were only Catholics and Jews. So if you're going to do industry, you got to do banking. Catholics couldn't do it, so the only ones left were the Jews. That sense of being able to live a life rooted in compassion. Pope John Paul II, in his conversations with the Dalai Lama, spoke about compassion as the root of religion. Pope Benedict XVI has repeated that in his very first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is love. And you and I hear it again and again and again. We hear it repeated to us, we hear it sung to us, we hear it read to us. What does it look like when we live it? It looks like forgiveness. It looks like mercy. It looks like understanding. It looks like hospitality. It looks like welcoming the stranger. It looks like all of these different things that the gospel teaches us week after week after week. It sounds so pretty when we sing it, and yet it's so hard to do. Because our human nature says no. Don't go that way. If you let that person into your life, do you know what that's going to cost you? If you are honest about that, do you know what's going to happen to you? If you forgive that person, you're going to look weak. If you stand strong for principles, you'll look like a wimp. If you stand for those things, people will not respect you. And yet, when we stand before our God, the only thing we have to stand with us is the elements of our life. What we have lived day to day. The way that we learn this is not because you went to religious ed and Carrie and her merry band of catechists have taught it to you so well, or because you went to Catholic school, to Palma or Notre Dame or to whatever other school. That's not where you learned it. Paul says in the second reading, what you have seen me do and heard me say, do that. You and I are meant to proclaim the gospel in the way we live our lives. Because, ladies and gentlemen, my brothers and sisters, people are watching us. And they will do not what we say, but what they see us do. Like Paul, we are walking evangelizers, walking catechists. We are the ones who first and foremost proclaim the truth of the gospel in the example of our lives. Sounds nice. We love to hold other people accountable for it. And so hard to do ourselves. And that's why we need each other. That's why we come to this Eucharist. Because living the gospel on a day-to-day basis is a challenge. And yet it's one that's worth our life. It's one that's worth the challenge. Not just because one day we're going to die and have to answer for it, but because we know people who have lived it every single day, who are living it every single day. And we see that their lives have meaning. Their lives have purpose. And we want a part of that. Very few of us want to just drift through life. Every single one of us wants to know that our life makes a difference. And overwhelmingly, those whose lives make a difference, and we can see it, are people who have rooted their lives on their faith. Let's you and I draw example from Paul today and root our life on the teachings of Jesus Christ so that on a day-to-day basis the people who meet us will be able to say, like they said in the early church, see how these Christians love one another.